Rainbow First Blood follows the character of John Rambo, a US Army veteran struggling with the after effects of the Vietnam War. The film was released and based in 1982, 7 years after the Vietnam War had ended. The Vietnam War was a war of attrition and fought differently in comparison to the World Wars and even Korea. The US involvement in Vietnam was triggered not only by the Cold War, but mostly the fear of the domino theory. The United States, despite their massive geographical distance from Vietnam, were determined to prevent South Vietnam from falling under communist rule. In the 1960s, the US conscripted and sent troops, military advisors, and advanced equipment to assist South Vietnam in the fight against the North and Viet Cong. At the time, home in the US, the anti-war movement grew stronger. The second wave of feminism rolled in, and the hippie counterculture was projected in conjunction with the televised war. Although the film was a fiction action film, the character, and moreover the struggles of the character in Rambo as a Vietnam veteran, are well represented. The film also highlights the mistreatment of soldiers returning from Vietnam and touches on how differently the Vietnam was perceived by the US public compared to previous conflicts. There's an interesting scene between Colonel Samuel Trotman and the sheriff, where Trotman explains that it gets confusing sometimes. In Vietnam, you can bet that Rambo and I got pretty confused, and that confusion was common amongst those returning from war, particularly those that served in Vietnam. Vietnam was predominantly guerrilla warfare. The enemy used surprise attacks and traps within the dense jungles of Vietnam, and the US troops struggled to navigate the land and identify the enemy, which was ultimately their downfall. The physical effects of wounded soldiers and the use of chemicals such as Agent Orange had detrimental effects, but the film focuses on the mental struggles, the shell shock, and the war-induced post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, that comes with war. The message behind the film is what acknowledges its reality. There's a lot of truth in the relationship Rambo had with civilians, their harsh perception of him as a returning soldier. One of the first interactions Rambo has with the public is his interaction with the sheriff, who says, "Wearing a flag like that, looking the way you do, you're asking for trouble." Many soldiers were made to feel ashamed of their participation in the Vietnam War, like Rambo, where they were expected to immerse themselves immediately back into society, somewhat seamlessly, and this can become confusing for those who serve. The companion reading I chose was a book by Andrew Weiss, Vietnam, A View from the Front Lines. The book is a collection of oral histories, interviews with the men themselves and their families who experienced Vietnam during the 60s and 70s. The chapter in focus, and the one in relation to Rambo, is the final chapter, Life After Nam, a detailed description of the ignorance and arrogance soldiers faced when returning to the States. There are many similarities between Rambo's final monologue in the film and the stories told by the soldiers of their mistreatment upon their return from Vietnam. Rambo expresses the pressures upon his return. "I came back into the world. I see all those maggots there protesting me, calling me a baby killer. Who are they to protest me?" This wasn't said for entertainment purposes, but reflected truth in the public's reaction towards military personnel at the time. "We were told in our classes that we were baby killers and rapists. They basically told us you guys' war wasn't a real war." The multiple oral histories in the companion reading solidified the reality of the film and portrayed genuine experiences of veterans with PTSD. Vietnam did not go away. It's always been there, and this was the harsh reality for struggling veterans, and something the film focused on, with Rambo's flashbacks, emotional breakdowns, and the struggle to conform back into civilian life. In conclusion, the film's relationship to reality on the surface doesn't seem to align, but the character of Rambo shows many characteristics of a veteran with PTSD and brings awareness to the struggles of those returning from war, and in particular Vietnam. Along with Weiss' primary sources, it reinforced the actuality of the character in Rambo and was disheartening to find that the treatment of soldiers upon their return was one of brutality. Vietnam was the lowest and biggest loss in the US military history, and therefore Vietnam veterans were not celebrated or paraded, although they were not necessarily looking for a parade, but certainly looking for basic human support and help to readjust to civilian life after the brutality of war, and Rambo sympathizes with this.